Okay. Woo. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. Always wanted to say that. So, good evening and welcome to an evening with Professor David Nutt. And what better way to ward off the January blues than spending an evening with David Nutt? And I have to tell you, you are in for an absolute treat, those of you who haven't heard him speak before. So the last time I chaired David speaking in this kind of forum, I must have left at about 9:15, and there was a queue of people waiting to get selfies with him, waiting to get his book signed, waiting to tell him all their problems. So that's a bit of a challenge for you this evening to see if we can keep him going even longer than then. I heard that he didn't get out till 10 o'clock that night. So I'm Jo Neal. I'm a prof here at Manchester, and I'm the immediate past president of the BAP. So that's the British Association for Psychopharmacology. And the reason the first slide has information about the BAP, it's really the website I want you to take note of. The BAP is the best organisation in the world. It's one of the largest psychopharm associations in the world as well. It's where psychiatry meets science. We prepare guidelines, evidence-based medicine for psychiatric disorders, and David has been involved with most of these. Those are free to download on our website, much better than any other guidelines, proper evidence-based guidelines from the experts. One of our main aims is education of psychiatrists and scientists about evidence-based medicine and brain diseases, but also for the general public. So if you look on the website, there's a BAP blog where you can find information about psychiatric disorders and information for the public, so put in a sensible, non-jargonistic way about latest developments in brain science. So I highly recommend that you have a look at the BAP website and keep up to date with the latest developments, because clearly you're interested in brain science because you're here. We have an annual meeting every year. Every year. This year it's in Manchester, and we have a lecture for the public, and it's going to be on hip-hop psychiatry this year. So I highly recommend you have a look at that and register for that sooner rather than later. So that's the BAP. The BAP are sponsoring tonight's event, so we have a lot to thank BAP for. I certainly have. Now, BAP are very privileged to have David Nutt so much involved with our organisation. So he was the president a couple of years ago, winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016. He's editor of our flagship journal, the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and he's been doing this for over 25 years. That's real commitment, and he has really elevated the status of the journal. For those of you who care about that stuff, the impact factor is nearly 5. Academics care about this stuff, I'm afraid. And normally, if I'm introducing somebody, I'll tell you all about their achievements and their accolades. So I'd known David for a long, long time, but I looked him up, and I highly recommend you do the same so you can find out as much as I have done about it. There are far, far too many achievements for me. You know, you've been listening to me, and nobody has come here tonight to hear me. So, you know, he's on television, he's a book author, he's done most things for the media apart from starring in a film, but I'm guessing that's coming any day now. I gather he was in a play recently. I know many of you will be familiar with his work. He's the founding chair of drug science. He was formerly the chair of the ACMD, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. And for me, it's his unfailing commitment to evidence-based science. And we all know about his work with psychoactive substances and cannabinoids, and really trying to put forward the evidence-based view always, which, as we know, the current drug laws are not based on. So reform of British drug policy. He's won loads of accolades. Loads of awards. I'm not going to go on about that. I'm just now going to hand you over to David, who's going to talk to you for the next hour. Then we're going to have a Q&A session. I've got some roving microphones. If you think that your voice will carry in this auditorium without that, by all means just stand up and bellow the question to David. I will be fielding those questions. Okay, so without further ado, I think we want to say a very warm Manchester welcome to David.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. So, well, it's great to be back here, and I gather I'm coming in the summer as well to the BAP meeting, as well as to the addiction meeting in November. Yes, and thank you for that welcome. So the reason the BAP started a public lecture series was because we have sort of discovered over the last 40 years that while science has gone forward, public understanding, particularly of the brain science that we do in relation to drugs in the brain, seems to have gone backwards. And there are a number of reasons for this, which I will touch on and we can reflect on in the discussion. But they asked me to try to put things in perspective, because I have been working in the field of psychiatry for over 40 years, so I've sort of seen it come, seen our discipline, particularly of psychopharmacology, blossom. And I'm in a position now to kind of reflect on my clinical experience and my research background, as well as, to a lesser extent, I'm going to talk about my policy involvements. So basically, I'm old enough to be able to tell you things which you don't know, and make sense to some extent of where we've gotten to where we are. Now, the title of the talk is a little provocative, and the reason I use the title is because there has been, for the whole period of my academic life, an opposing viewpoint, pioneered by this man, Thomas Sachs. So I started in medicine in 1969. In 1971, he published his book, The Myth of Mental Illness. Actually, Thomas has been really quite broad in his assault on every discipline relating to psychiatry, because he hates concepts of madness and also psychotherapy. But he's been around and he's still alive, and he's still promoting a perspective on brain illness and brain treatments, which is exactly the polar opposite of mine. And he's very persuasive, and he certainly sells more books than me. So it's important that people stand up to him. And he has followers, and this was last year's book, trying to demolish the psychiatric perspective on depression, Johann Hari's book. Now, Johann Hari's a friend of mine. He actually wrote a really good book about the origins of the war on drugs and the problems of addiction, which I endorsed. And then he wrote this book. But for some reason, he didn't share this book with me, unlike the other one, because I think he probably realized I would have torn it apart, because it's largely rubbish. So. But that is the problem. If you don't know the science, it's difficult to write much sense. So let's think a bit about brain function. And the brain is a very complicated organ. It's the most complicated known element in the whole of the universe. And the brain is made up of neurons. And neurons connect to each other, communicate with each other by chemicals called neurotransmitters. And one of the sort of simple perspectives on the brain is that the nerves are hardware and the neurotransmitters are kind of software. There are at least 80 neurotransmitters. That gives an enormous amount of flexibility, particularly as many of the receptors have many of the neurotransmitters, have multiple receptors. So there's way more than 80 different ways of communicating. And over the last 40 years, I think there have been three major drivers in terms of our understanding the science of the brain and the science of psychiatry. And those have been imaging, which is what I've been doing and what I'm going to talk largely about. Molecular neuroscience, trying to decode the relationship between genes, proteins, and the structure and function of neurons. And genetics. We know a lot now about particularly the genetics relating to vulnerability to psychiatric disorder, but also to structural problems in disorders like epilepsy. So those are the three great developments, themes of research. And I'm going to focus on imaging because that's what I know about, and actually because that's really what gets me, and I think all of us, closer to where the action is than anything else. It's a long way from a gene to someone having a delusion that they're God. But maybe you could see the nature of the delusion if you used imaging. So there's a pretty little picture of someone looking inside a brain. That's obviously fanciful. The way we look into brains, we can image brains in a number of ways. We can do structural imaging with techniques, particularly now like MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And we can do functional measurements. We can measure changes in blood flow, and changes in brain blood flow largely mirror changes in neural activity. And we can do that using techniques like PET and SPECT or fMRI or EEG or MEG. But we can also look at the neurochemistry of the brain using particularly PET and SPECT. We can, in a few cases, we can measure the release of neurotransmitters in the brain by displacement of a radioactive tracer. So we have quite a lot of tools. And over the last 40 years, those tools have been applied to many different questions in psychiatry. This is an example of how you can use MRI to make diagnoses. There you see, on the left, you see a number of white lumps in the brain of someone with multiple sclerosis. Those are the plaques. And then on the right, you can see a big white lump, and that's a glioma. So we can measure changes in brain structure and intrusions in the brain by pathological processes like MS. But we can also measure the brain itself, measure the volume of the brain, and see whether it's altered in different conditions where we think it might be altered. I mean, this is one of the famous case histories in modern psychiatry. There's Homer, and not many people have a brain smaller than their upper lip. But the question in Homer's case, of course, is the shrinkage, was it there at birth, or was it due to him becoming demented, or is it due to his drinking, or probably some combination of all three? But that's light-hearted. In reality, and this is my own research, the drug which really does shrink the brain is alcohol. So these are 4 images. The top 4 images are of people in a research study of mine, and the bottom 4 images are people in a research study. And the bottom 4 are alcoholics, and the top 4 are age and sex match controls. And you can see that the brains at the bottom have got more black stuff in them, particularly in the middle. The black stuff's water. So the lower brains, the lower row of brains, have got more water because the brain tissue itself has shrunk. And it's shrunk as a result of too much drinking. Now these people are interesting. They're no longer drinking, so it's not the acute effect of alcohol shrinking their brain. They're actually able, just about, to find their way to my laboratories in London to be part of a study. But their brains are as damaged as people with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, it's becoming accepted now that chronic alcohol consumption is probably the most common preventable cause of Alzheimer's. About 20% of all Alzheimer's is probably due to alcohol. And those brains are indistinguishable from people with Alzheimer's. So that's a real challenge to us, particularly these people, those 4 people, because they're no longer drinking. What we want to do is try to restore their brains to where they were. It's probably impossible, but at the very least try to prevent them relapsing back to drinking, because if they were to do that, then it would accelerate their decline. And here is a very famous person who died from alcohol, but whose death generally was not understood to be due to alcohol. When Amy Winehouse died, I assumed she died from taking some expensive combination of drugs. She was a rich young girl. In fact, it turned out, I didn't know until I saw the film of her life, which is a remarkable film, that she was a heroin addict as well as an alcoholic. And she stopped using heroin, she stopped drinking, and then she relapsed. And when she relapsed to drinking, and she died. She drank a litre of vodka in one sitting, and she died. And she died with a blood alcohol level that wouldn't have killed her if she hadn't stopped drinking. She died because she had lost tolerance. She'd been abstinent or dry for 6 weeks. She'd lost tolerance to alcohol. And when she relapsed, she drank a lot and died. And that's very sad, because if we had treatments to stop relapse, she may not have died. But there's almost no treatment available for preventing relapse of alcoholism, or reality, most disorders, most drug addiction disorders. And one of the things I feel strongly about is that the current government says that's all you need to do. All you need to do is stop using a drug for 6 weeks to be cured. Knowing that that kind of policy, the abstinence-based policy, puts you or that person at a much greater risk of dying if they do relapse. And almost everyone relapses at least once. Now, one of the great advances we've been able to make in using brain imaging is to explore the brain circuits which underpin addiction. And there's images from the study that those alcoholics were part of. This is a study, a very big study, which Manchester was part. It was a 3-university study, Imperial College, where I am, Manchester and Cambridge. We got together, and this is the most sophisticated imaging study that's ever been done in addiction. We were looking to see what the brain processes of addiction were and to see whether we could find treatments which could potentially help people like Amy stay abstinent. And we developed testing paradigms to measure features of addiction, such as in this case, reward. And here you see, those images you see there are 3 images of the brain from 3 different sides. Sideways on, in the middle is front on, and then the one on the right is top down. And the areas I've put a ring around, those are areas of the brain where there's a lot of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. And those are the areas of the brain which are very implicated in motivated behavior. When someone takes a drug, whether they like it or not, that region becomes quite activated. And we're able now to measure activation in those regions using this MRI technique called fMRI. We get people to do a task which rewards them. They earn money if they do the task well. And then that part of the brain which registers reward becomes activated. And you see the color coding in these images. You'll see a lot of color coding. The hotter it is, the more activity there is. So red and orange is more. And if you see blue, that means there's less. And those brain regions are turned off. A couple of years ago, we were able to use this technology we developed to ask a question about a new treatment. Narmorphine is a recently licensed treatment to help people control their drinking. It's the first, what I call, drinking regulator. It is a drug which people take when they are drinking to help them control their drinking. So people who have loss of control drinking, the sort of person that you all know who says, I'm only going to have 2 pints, but then ends up being blind drunk after spending an evening massively over-consuming, and does that night after night after night, always with the intention of not doing it. Those loss of control drinkers can take narmorphine when they're going to start drinking, and it will help control that. It will help reduce the number of times that they lose control. So the drug is licensed. It's licensed in UK and in many other European countries to help regulate binge drinking. How does it work? Well, we asked the question, and this is the result. What narmorphine does is when you give it to alcoholics and you scan their brains when they're drunk, it dampens down the reward pathway. You can see there, those images are blue rather than red, and that tells you that under the narmorphine, there's less activity in the reward pathway. And we now believe that narmorphine works by turning off that on switch that alcohol produces. People who lose control, they start drinking, their reward system gets turned on, and then they want to continue to turn it on with the alcohol. And narmorphine, by dampening that down, allows them to drink as they wanted to drink rather than as they have previously been drinking. Here's another very famous person who died. Now, I actually didn't realize that Seymour Hoffman was a heroin addict, or had been a heroin addict, till he died. And he managed for 23 years to be clean. During that time, he became, one of the world's greatest actors, won an Oscar, and yet he's now dead. He's dead of heroin. And that's a very sad story. And it also tells us what I guess many, many people who actually are addicted have told us for decades, that once you have been addicted, it's very difficult to be sure you're not going to relapse to addiction again. So for reasons we still don't fully understand, after 23 years of being abstinent, he went through a period of his life when he decided to start using again. It was probably due to stress. which seems to be the major provocation for relapse to many drugs. But for him, as a heroin user, the only treatments we really have are treatments which are alternative forms of heroin, drugs like methadone or buprenorphine. If you go onto those, you stay addicted. And of course, if he was to go into a regular treatment with those, he'd be seen going in to get his daily administrations of his drug. That would destroy his career. So he chose, I guess, not to do that. He chose actually to try to keep it secret. And then he started using, and he died. And here's another good example of why we need to find treatments which don't addict you, but which can help you regulate your propensity to addiction. And one of the earliest studies we did imaging addiction was this one, nearly 20 years ago now. We were looking at the brain circuits which were activated when people who were heroin addicts but who were no longer using heroin remembered what it was like to crave heroin or to use heroin. And we found that those regions, those two regions there in the front of the brain, were activated. And that's not particularly surprising because we know that those regions of the brain are involved in emotional regulation and also decision making. But what was surprising and completely unexpected was this finding, that the longer people were abstinent, the greater was the activity, particularly of that orbitofrontal region. Now, that tells us one thing. It tells us that when people have been addicted, they don't lose sensitivity to the cues that lead to craving. We don't know whether that's a good thing, that the more activation means they're able to control the cues better, or whether it's a sign that they're more vulnerable. Very, very hard to distinguish those two. But what it tells us categorically is that you do not lose your sensitivity to heroin cues, even when you've been abstinent here for over 3 years. So this is a sort of first biological fingerprint of this old adage that once an addict, always an addict. And therefore, it really emphasizes the need to try to find treatments which can help you stop relapsing without keeping you addicted. And this initiative, this ICAM initiative with Imperial, Manchester and Cambridge, we looked at a range of different drugs that could potentially interfere with this process. And here is the results of one of the experiments we did. So we're taking these abstinent heroin addicts, we're scanning them, and we're looking at the effect here of a drug which is called an NK1 antagonist. These are drugs which are licensed, one of them at least is licensed for chemotherapy-induced nausea, where it works in the brain stem to stop people vomiting. But we have good evidence that this particular neurotransmitter system is involved in emotion regulation. And here you see that there is a significant attenuation of the brain activity in these abstinent addicts when they are provoked by stressful images. That's what the evocative task means. And because of that, because we could see that these drugs dampen down emotional reactivity, and we know that stress is a provocation. We got a grant, and we've recently got a grant. Anne Lingford Hughes, working with me, has got a grant now to trial one of these treatments in people who are coming off methadone or heroin, to see whether this can help them stay abstinent by helping their brains become more resistant to emotional stresses, and that might then provoke relapse. So here's an example of what we call translational medicine. We do science, we see an effect in the brain, and we're now going to find out whether that effect translates into a clinical outcome. So that was a bit about addiction. What about another behavioral disorder? What about obsessive-compulsive disorder? The ritualization that people have in terms of hand-washing or organizing peas into perfect lines or making lists and making lists and making lists. very difficult disorder to treat. But in fact, the first disorder we could say categorically was associated with an alteration in brain function. And here's a classic. This is a 20-year-old brain image. Imaging using a technique called SPECT. It's looking at the activity of the brain on the left-hand side, a normal control, on the right-hand side, someone with OCD. And you can see that there's greater activity in the OCD patients in the frontal part of the brain. We now know that there are about 30 separate studies now have shown that obsessive-compulsive disorder is a circuit disorder. It's a disorder whereby the frontal lobe of the brain, which is the link between this part of the brain here and this part of the brain, the caudate nucleus, is overactive. That's exemplified here. That overactivity is what drives the repeated behavior. So you can see the brain system which drives the behavior. And how do we know that? Because if you treat people, that overactivity diminishes. And it doesn't matter whether you treat them with an antidepressant, an SSRI, or you treat them with behavior therapy. In both cases, you can dampen down that overactivity. So recovery from OCD involves reducing that hyperconnectiveness. And it's turned out that that actually seems to be a phenomenon that underpins a number of other psychiatric disorders. Overactivity of circuits needs to be disrupted to allow people to recover. I've mentioned PET scanning already. This is an image, a schematic of it. It's a powerful technique, unfortunately a very expensive technique, so that's why very little is done in the UK. But Manchester is one of the few centres, along with Imperial, which has the technology to do PET scanning. You basically have to make a radioactive tracer, inject it into people, and then use a whole ring of detectors in a super camera. That works out where the radioactive decay occurs and then extrapolates back to locate that. And we have tools now to look at a whole range of different neurotransmitters and chemical receptors with PET scanning. And the one with the arrow there, the second one along from the left, that is a tracer which binds to the benzodiazepine receptor. You all know what benzodiazepines are, drugs like Valium, which calm the brain down. That tracer is the antidote to Valium. It's an antagonist, so it doesn't have any effects itself. But it's a very good label for the number of these receptors. And we were very interested in this. This is really how we started, where we started our imaging work, because I was intrigued by the problem of panic attacks. Why do people have panic attacks? Why do people have sudden surges of anxiety, which make them feel that they're dying or make them faint, make them run away and never go back to the supermarket again? And I wondered whether that was a kind of epilepsy, that this sudden surge of anxiety was like an epileptic attack in an anxiety circuit. An epilepsy, of course, is usually an attack in a motor circuit, so you see people shaking a limb or moving their mouths, etc. And we had discovered, a group in Sweden had discovered in 1986, that people with epilepsy have a reduction in the density of these benzodiazepine receptors in the parts of the brain from which the seizures come. In fact, that is now a diagnostic tool. In top centres, before they do surgery for epilepsy, they do PET scanning to see where the epilepsy is. So we did a study. We did a study where we looked at the density of these inhibitory, calming brain receptors in panic disorder. And you can see the left-hand side is a normal brain, the right-hand side is someone with panic disorder. There's fewer of these receptors in the brains of people with panic disorder, just as there are fewer of them in people with epilepsy. And so that was the first biological knowledge of what might cause people to have panics. And what's interesting about that particular image is that the distribution is largely in areas of the brain which do, we know from other kinds of research, drive anxiety. So here, for instance, you're looking at the absolute density of these receptors. Up is more. In an area of the brain, the right orbitofrontal cortex, the front of the brain, the part of the brain which orchestrates escape behavior if you have a panic. and the posterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain which has nothing to do with anxiety. And you can see in the right orbitofrontal cortex, the left-hand image there, the patient with the highest number of receptors had less receptors than the normal control with the lowest number. There was no overlap. So it's diagnostic. You could argue that you could use PET imaging to diagnose panic disorder if that kind of discrimination was verified. Of course, you wouldn't do that because each scan costs about £10,000. It's much simpler just to ask the patient if they're having panic attacks. But it does show that there is a biological distinction in the brains of people who do have panics and those who don't. We've now moved on to look at different subtypes. This benzodiazepine receptor is extremely complicated. There are multiple different subtypes. And one of them is this subtype, the alpha-5 subtype. And this is highly distributed, highly densely expressed in this area of the brain, at the front of the brain, in the middle at the front of the brain. And that's a key area of the brain in relation to addiction. And we have now shown that the people with both alcohol addiction and heroin addiction have a deficiency of those receptors in that circuit. And we believe that is why they have trouble controlling their behavior relating to drugs. Because if you have less of those receptors, then you have less inhibition of the drives, the urges to use drugs. One other anxiety disorder which has turned out to be associated with a deficiency of these inhibitory benzodiazepine receptors is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And here you see the first SPECT scan from Yale showing that there's a relative deficiency of these receptors in this area of the brain. In the right, this is the front of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, and that's been replicated by a group in the Netherlands. So people with PTSD have a deficiency of inhibition in this medial prefrontal region. Now that's particularly interesting because when you do fMRI studies, which are much cheaper to do and there'll be many more of them, of people with PTSD, it turns out that that's the region of the brain which drives the emergence of the traumatic memories. So we have this really unusual and powerful coexistence now of an MRI-induced measured abnormality and a PET or SPECT measured abnormality. We believe now that the failure to control the re-emergence of emotional memories in PTSD, which is what PTSD is. PTSD is a disorder where the emotion of a memory suddenly comes back into consciousness and overrides what you're doing at the time. That's because the brain isn't able to suppress traumatic memories. You've all been traumatized. Every one of us has had a traumatic memory. But until I started talking about it, most of you weren't thinking about yours, which is a good thing because it interferes with life. And the reason you don't think about it is because you suppress those memories. But if you've got a deficiency of suppression, because those receptors are not acting properly, then the emergence of the memories becomes more likely and therefore damaging. And PTSD in many ways is the disorder of our century. We've got 40% of Rwandans. Most Syrians have been traumatized. They won't all end up with PTSD. But the way in which wars are being promulgated these days is very destructive to the civilian population. And all the refugees who've been trying to get out of Syria, they will all have a vulnerability to PTSD. And perhaps even more remarkably, and this is something which I think hopefully politicians will take note of, that PTSD is what's killing our soldiers. More American soldiers have killed themselves than have been killed by the enemy. And that's because they're coming back from a war that they don't understand. Couldn't even see the enemy in most cases. Were being blown up on occasions and realizing it was all pointless, and so they killed themselves. And this is quite a huge economic problem for the military. It's also a moral problem as well. And there's a little image of a girl living in Aleppo. It's hard to imagine how you could survive 3 years of barrel bombing and not be traumatized. Well, we might know what's wrong with the brain in PTSD, but how do we treat it? And one of the real exciting breakthroughs in the last decade has been the discovery that MDMA, ecstasy, is a powerful treatment for PTSD. This is the first study done by a man called Mithofer 6 years ago now. He took people, mostly soldiers, who'd failed on 2 treatments, CBT and drugs, and he put them through 2 MDMA sessions. These are treatment sessions where people get MDMA, 125 milligrams, and then 2 weeks apart, they're asked to relive the trauma and gain mastery over the emotions, get control of the emotions so they can talk about the emotions so that when they start to emerge, they can suppress them. And it's a powerful treatment. You can see it 2 months and up to 4 years. Some of those have gone up to 7 years now. You get a very significant reduction, and almost everyone gets symptoms which are below that blue line. That blue line is the line of clinical diagnosis. So here we have an illegal drug, MDMA, which is a powerful psychotherapeutic agent. How does it work? Well, no one knows. No one knew until we did this study with Channel 4. And people often say, well, why would you go to a TV channel to do a study? Isn't that just showmanship? Isn't that just trying to kind of, get a lot of publicity? And the answer is no. The answer is that Channel 4 were the only people that would fund this study. The MRC wouldn't fund it. The Wellcome Trust wouldn't fund it. Because they said to study an illegal drug was to give some kind of credibility, some legitimacy to people using it recreationally. An absurd statement, but it's a very common statement. When things are illegal, government institutions, charities are very, very scared of working with some things which are illegal. And in fact, Channel 4 approached us. The story is quite an interesting story. The Channel 4 approached me and said, would I do a study giving cocaine live on TV? I said, no, there's nothing interesting there because we know what cocaine does in the brain. That study's been done. And they went away, and they came back a month later and they said, well, what Class A drug would you give live on TV? And we did it. And there's Jon Snow with his pill. And the good thing is that we were able to do a study paid for by a TV company. And it turned out to be a remarkably interesting study. During the study, we got people to write down 6 memories, 6 good memories, 6 bad memories. We didn't want to know what the memories were because that might upset us, and it might also upset people telling the truth about them. But they remembered each memory, and then at points during the scans, we said memory 1, memory 2, memory 3. And they had a placebo scan, they had an MDMA scan. And on the left-hand side there, you see under the MDMA scans, the pink, the pleasure, the good memories were enhanced. You see, all the pink bars are higher because MDMA makes people happier and good memories are improved. But on the right-hand side, you see the bad memory, the negative memory was decreased. And that was the first pointer to the fact that MDMA in normal people, they haven't got PTSD, can actually suppress negative memories. And did any of you see the program? I mean, what was remarkable, that one of the subjects in the program was a female priest. And she hadn't told us she'd been abused. But when she came out of the scan on MDMA, she said, one of my memories was of my being abused. And now I've overcome it. And it's a really powerful testimony if you go back and see the program. She said, I've understood now the problem and I can put it away. I've overcome the emotion of the trauma just after that single exposure to MDMA in a scanner. So you imagine what you can do if you do it in a proper therapeutic session outside of a scanner. But the reason we did it in the scanner was because we wanted to know where this drug works. And here are some brain images of the effects of MDMA, different areas of the brain. The first thing you see is it's all blue. This drug, which can make you love up and can allow you dance for hours, just switches off the brain. It dampens down brain activity. But not everywhere in the brain, just in those regions deep here, deep inside the brain here, these areas here. Those areas deep inside the brain, which are the areas of the hippocampus and the amygdala, the areas which regulate memory and emotion. And we can show that the changes in emotion that people had were correlated with those alterations, reductions in activity in those brain regions. I should just say that we've now started the first MDMA trial in Britain based on these findings, trying to help people overcome memories of trauma which are leading them to drink too much. What about depression? Now, depression has become a bit of a war zone in recent years because there's a whole group of individuals who say depression is just a construct by doctors and by the pharmaceutical industry, and there is no evidence that depression has got anything to do with the brain, and that serotonin is just something that drug companies use to sell their drugs. Well, the truth is there is actually rather good evidence that serotonin has got something to do with depression, and there it is. So this is the work of Paul Grasby and colleagues working in where I'm working in the Hammersmith Hospital, and they scanned the brains of people with depression using a tracer which binds to one of the serotonin receptors, the serotonin 5-HT1A receptor. And this receptor is heavily distributed and it's densely expressed in areas of the brain which control emotion. And the top image is a normal control, and the bottom image is someone with depression. And it's pretty obvious that the person with depression has got less receptors. And what's important about those receptors is that they dampen down the stress response in the brain. So if you haven't got so many of them, you get less dampening down. And what SSRIs do is they put serotonin, they enhance serotonin levels in those parts of the brain, and therefore they offset the deficit. So SSRIs kind of correct an endogenous deficit in inhibition of depression. In the same way that benzodiazepines, in another part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, dampen down a deficiency of inhibition in anxiety. And in fact, it turns out that almost all the drugs we use to treat depression work on the serotonin system. So all the red blocks there are drugs which work on serotonin. So most of the antidepressants we have work on serotonin. You can lift depression working on noradrenaline and dopamine, and so often we have to resort to that or use those drugs in combination with the serotonin drugs. But there's very powerful evidence that serotonin is a mediator of the antidepressant effect of drugs as well as the potential cause of depression. What's particularly interesting is that the regulation of those receptors, which I showed you were down, were reduced in people with depression, that's susceptible to psychotherapy treatments. This is a rather cute study from Finland where they looked at people with depression and then they measured the brain density of receptors before and after treatment, and they showed that psychotherapy increases the number of serotonin receptors. So it may be that psychotherapy restores good mood by allowing the brain to grow the receptors which have been potentially suppressed by chronic stress. And here is, I think, an even more profound and powerful experiment. This is one of the most remarkable experiments that's been done in the last 50 years. And this was started off being done at Yale by Delgado and Charney and was repeated by Smith and Cowan in Oxford. And they took people who were recovered from depression, so-called euthymic. See, up the top left, their mood is normal. And then they depleted their brains of serotonin. And you can do that in the space of a few hours by giving a particular diet. And you can see that over those 5 hours, the mood crashed. And people went from being euthymic, normal, to being depressed. And sometimes their depressive delusions came back. There was one woman in the Delgado study who believed the devil was on her back. It's a common delusion in depression in people who have religious beliefs. And the devil had gone. The treatment had got rid of the devil, and it came back when you depleted serotonin. Now that's a remarkable finding because it tells us that in those people, the depression, the depressive ideas, the depressive cognitions have not gone away. They've just been suppressed. They're still in the brain. They're being kept under control by serotonin. And when you deplete serotonin, they come back. And that's a profoundly important finding. And it explains why depression is such a difficult disorder to treat because the vulnerability stays there in the same way as you can't unforget the trauma of PTSD. You don't seem to be able to, at least for many years, unforget the processes which drive depression. But the other fascinating phenomenon there is as soon as tryptophan levels in their body were restored by giving them a protein meal, everything went away. And that tells us that we are more vulnerable to perturbations in mood through alterations in the availability of neurotransmitters or precursors of neurotransmitters than we ever thought possible. And this is how I explain to my patients and conceptualize to my researchers how drugs like SSRIs are working. And here I have deliberately used psychological explanations for depression and anxiety rather than psychiatry ones. So there's a huge field of psychological interrogation of anxiety and depression which says that both those two disorders are associated with negative affective valence. Anxious people, depressed people see the world as a nasty, hostile, and unpleasant place. And that is why they suffer. Actually, they're right. It is. But that doesn't help you. It really doesn't. Most of us who resist depression and anxiety have what we call optimism bias. We tend to see the world as better than it is. Now, when you take those people with negative affective valence, and you give them an SSRI, you increase serotonin levels, and that pushes them into the same arena as a normal person with a positive affective valence. It also does something else. It gives them increased resilience. Serotonin promotes resilience. SSRIs increase serotonin, they promote resilience. They protect people against the stresses of life. And we know that because if you take away the SSRI, you take away the serotonin, then they switch back within hours to this negative affective valence. So that's a kind of simple perspective on how serotonin and the drugs which regulate serotonin can help control both anxiety and depression. And I want to finish by moving into a new area of research which has only been possible since we've had brain imaging, and that's the imaging of brain networks, because we didn't know these networks existed until we started to be able to measure activity in the brain certainly on a sub-second basis. So there's the original theory, which is amusing but not quite right. There are many networks. Some people say 13, some people say 17. Here are some of the most important ones that you're using today. There are visual networks, there are auditory networks. But the most interesting one is the top right one, called the default mode network. And I want to walk you through the default mode network, because this is a network which we didn't know existed, and most of us didn't even think it existed until we were able to see it. So all those different images have a color coding, and the color coding tells you areas of the brain which change their activity in synchrony with each other. So areas that are red go up when the other areas go up, and go down when the other areas go down. So obviously the visual cortex, when you're seeing things, the visual system is activated. When you're hearing things, the auditory cortex is activated. When you're moving your fingers and your arms, the sensory motor cortex is activated. But this default mode network only emerges when you're not doing things. And that's why it's called the default mode network. So I'm going to activate the default mode network in all of you now. So you're going to close your eyes, and I'm going to stop speaking. And I want you, when I stop speaking, I want you to reflect on whether you now think it was worth coming to this talk and what else you might have done otherwise, and how you would explain to your partners or family what you got out of this. Okay, now the doing of that has switched off your visual system, switched off your auditory system, The part of the brain which was, the parts of the network which was working is the default mode network, and this is that network there. And you can see it's a network which has got a frontal bit, 2 lateral bits, and another bit in the middle at the back there. And that's the network which does the thinking about you. It's where you are, where your persona is, where your, some people say it's where your soul is. Freudians would say that's where your ego is. It's certainly where you are. If you damage that network, you are a different person. It turns out that that network is problematic in depression. So what you see, look at the top left-hand image. The top left-hand image shows 2 brains. The inside and outside of the top 2 are controls, and the bottom are inside and outside of the brains of depressed people. And you can see that red means activity. There is more activity in the default mode network in depressed people than in non-depressed people. More of their brain is engaged in thinking about themselves, which kind of makes sense because that's what depression is. Depression is a state where people ruminate about mistakes they've made, guilty feelings they had, etc. And this particular study showed very clearly that the more depressed people ruminate, the greater the connectivity of their brains. And when depressed people are using so much of their brain just thinking about themselves and their feelings and their mistakes, it's not surprising that they haven't got the capacity to do other things like read books or go to work, because their mental capacity is being drained by this terrible amount of rumination. And what drives that, interestingly, is in the top right-hand image, which is, you see there's an area right deep in the lower part of the brain called the subgenual cingulate cortex. And that drives this overactivity, that orchestrates this excessive negative introspective thinking. And that's a very important area for depression research, and I'll show you why in a minute. So we have this overactivity in depressed people. How can we rectify this? How can we stop it happening? Well, a few years ago, we were studying the effect of magic mushrooms on the brain. We were interested in the nature of hallucinations produced by psychedelics. And to our amazement, we discovered that magic mushrooms completely disrupt the default mode network. So there you see the top image is the brain under placebo, and the bottom image is the default mode network under magic mushrooms. There is no default mode network. And that kind of makes perfect sense, because a lot of people, when they're having a very powerful trip, they don't feel they're themselves. Sometimes they feel they've been atomized and they floated out into space, and some of them go and talk to God. The good news is they all come back, so they're all reassembled in the scanner before we take them out, which is... But their brain is really different during a trip. And we began to wonder, well, does this have implications for treatment? Would disrupting the default mode in depressed people get them better? We noted that many of our volunteers said they felt better for several weeks after having a single psilocybin trip, even in a brain scanner. And then we're also conscious of this research done by Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, who'd taken people who weren't depressed, middle-aged people, who just wanted to experience something better in life. He'd given them a single dose of psilocybin, the same doses we used, 25 milligrams. And many of them said this was a profoundly beneficial experience. They had long-lasting sense of wellness. A lot of them said it was one of the 5 most meaningful experiences in their life. And many of them have stayed in a sort of state of betterness, improved well-being, for years afterwards. So we thought, well, maybe psilocybin could be antidepressant for these reasons. It makes people, improves wellness in normal people, disrupts the circuit that causes depression. And so we wrote a grant. And to our amazement, we got funded. The only grant that's ever been funded for work on psychedelics in the last 50 years in Britain. And the reason it was funded is because depression is such a powerful problem, such a massive problem, such a difficult disorder to treat. But actually getting the grant was the easy bit. Because psilocybin's illegal, it took 3 goes at the ethics committee to get it through. They said, well, how do you know it won't kill people? And we said, well, 1 million people a year use it, you know. pretty unlikely to kill people. The MHRA say it's safe. They said, you don't know depressed people. They said, quite likely depressed people have taken it. Anyway, in the end, they wouldn't let us do a controlled study. They said we had to do a safety study. We had to give it to 12 people, follow them up for 6 months and make sure none of them died, and then we could do a controlled study. And the ethics committee has so much power, we had to agree. But I said, look, of course we'll do that. That's exactly what we'll do. Thank you. And you will let us measure their mood as well in case they get worse. And he said, of course, you must measure the mood, you know. So the mood outcome was a secondary outcome. Whether they lived or died was the primary. But that was easy. Getting the drug, an illegal drug, only one place in the world will make it to the standards we needed to take it. It took 30 months to get the drug. It took 2 months to get the MHRA to approve. And it turned out it cost all this rigmarole cost £1,500 per dose. I have to get a special license, a special safe to put it in. And when you talk to the Home Office, you say, you know, it seems a little excessive. I'm a doctor. I can write a prescription for heroin. Why do I have to have a special police check to hold psilocybin? And he said, well, you could be dealing it on the streets. And saying it, £1,500 a dose, not even in Chelsea am I going to get. It's absurd. I mean, it's absolutely. But that's the way it works. So here's the study. We did this feasibility study, 12 subjects to show if they stayed alive. They all did. Added another 8 afterwards to do some brain science as well to strengthen the brain science. They'd all had treatment-resistant major depression. They'd all failed CBT. They'd failed on up to 18 different antidepressants. We gave us a test dose, a small dose, 10 milligrams, and a 25 milligram dose a week apart. And here are the results. Here are the results on those 12 people. And you can see they all got significantly better. And half of them went from being depressed to undepressed. That yellow bar at the bottom is non-depressed. So half of a group of people who'd had chronic resistant depression were cured in a week. Well, in fact, they were cured in a day after a psilocybin treatment. That's a hugely powerful effect. Remarkable. In fact, it's so powerful now that there's a multi-center study going on around Europe to see whether that's what the dose effect is and to see whether it can get a license. But it shows how if you get insights from brain science, you can begin to think more rationally about new kinds of treatments. And this could be an important new treatment for depression. How does it work? Well, one of the things we've discovered doing our psychedelic work, we did the first ever brain imaging study on LSD. That's the brain under LSD. The reason people have very powerful, complex visual hallucinations with their eyes closed on LSD is because their brains are much more connected. On the left-hand side is how your brain normally works. So all of you looking at me now, your brain, your visual cortex is really lazy. It's just seeing me and talking to itself. Under LSD, you'd be seeing lots of more interesting things than me. And all parts of your brain will be talking to themselves. And the psychedelics change the way the brain integrates information and allows people to come up with new solutions. You see different ways of thinking about things. And we've shown that psychedelics change attitude. I told you before that depressed and anxious people have negative valence. So here's our own data. They do. Our depressed people have pessimism bias. They see the world as more negative than non-depressed people. But after psychedelics, they see the world like the rest of us. They have this positive bias. And here's one of the patients. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as though I've seen a much clearer picture. And that the brain science under that is very clear. You break down the default mode network so they can no longer engage in that negative thinking. And when they come out of the trip, for a period, maybe months or years, their brain is not depressed. But of course, for some people, it does come back. One of the challenges for us is those people in whom after 6 months, well, I think 3 months here, the depression was coming back. And that's why I emphasized early on, depression probably never goes away, but you have to develop strategies to overcome it and suppress it and keep it at bay. And we're thinking about how to do that with psychedelics. Maybe we should be giving them every twice a year. So instead of going to Ibiza, you might go somewhere else and take psilocybin and have a bit of yoga, a bit of mushrooms, and you might be well for the next 6 months. And I'm going to finish with this great quote from the the philosopher and playwright George Bernard Shaw, who said, those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And I hope that what I've done tonight is sort of share with you some interesting insights into the brain science of psychiatry and of psychotropic drugs. And I hope for those of you who weren't already convinced that there is a science to psychiatry, you have some inkling that there is now. So if you want to read more about our research, this is a paper that is a freebie. It was published just last year, explaining the different ways in which antidepressants and psychedelics can help lift depression. By the way, the Journal of Psychopharmacology is the journal that Joe pointed out is the BAP journal. So we think now there are two ways to lift depression. SSRIs protect you against stress and allow your brain to cope with living in a stressful environment. And psychedelics, working in a completely different part of the brain, the cortex, reframe your attitude to life so that you have a different perspective. You can kind of have a more adaptive response to the stress. And then, of course, there's my book. If you haven't read it, you should. It's all about drugs, legal drugs. All the proceeds support my charity, Drug Science, and that's a charity which is probably the only website and charity in the world that really tells the truth about drugs. If you do buy the book, next time I'm here in Manchester, I'll sign it for you. Thank you very much.